Greetings to all viewers tuning in to the History War channel. Some fortresses are built never to fall, and some battles are won without ever needing to attack those fortresses. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers sat entrenched in the strongest bases across the Pacific, waiting for an invasion that would never come. They were not defeated in a decisive battle. They lost because the war simply passed them by. In today's story, we'll dive into the moment when strategic thinking reshaped the entire course of the war, when maps became weapons and time became the most ruthless enemy of all. If you enjoy historical stories told with depth, patience, and a true sense of what war really is, consider subscribing to History War and join us as we explore turning points where no gunshots were fired, but the fate of the entire war was decided. Now, let's return to that fateful morning. The morning of February 17th, 1944 began like so many others across the vast ocean, where the line between night and day was never quite clear. The eastern Pacific sky still held a deep navy blue, and the salty mist floated in the cold pre-dawn air. On the decks of American aircraft carriers, dim yellow lights glowed over narrow runways where pilots stood silently by their Hellcats. There were no speeches, no rallying cries, only the heavy silence of men who knew they were flying into a moment history would never revisit. Engines roared to life, shattering the stillness of the sea. One by one, planes left the decks, launching into a thick black void ahead. No landmarks, no guiding lights, only compasses, watches, and unwavering trust in a plan crafted months in advance. As the final aircraft disappeared into the darkness, behind them floated a silent, massive fleet, as if the full might of America was holding its breath. Dozens of nautical miles away was a place the Japanese believed no enemy would dare challenge head-on. A natural fortress, blessed by geography and reinforced by men over more than 2 decades. Razor-sharp coral reefs encircled a vast lagoon. Coastal guns pointed out toward the open sea. Tunnels carved deep into volcanic rock, capable of sheltering an entire army. Fuel, ammunition, and food stockpiled for a siege that could last for months. The Japanese called it Truk. To them, it was more than just a base. It was a symbol of control, the anchor holding together Japan's entire Pacific defense network. Truk had been the harbor of the Empire's largest warships, the transit hub for aircraft, submarines, and reinforcements. In traditional military thinking, as long as Truk stood, the war could not be lost. But on that morning, the true danger wasn't in the bombs about to fall, it was in their purpose. The Americans didn't come to plant a flag. They didn't come to storm the beaches, dig trenches, or fight for every bloody inch of land. They came to do something far more precise and far more brutal, to make Truk a fortress no one would ever need to capture. In the moment those Hellcats crossed the horizon, a new chapter of the Pacific War began, though neither side fully realized it yet. A chapter not about heroism on the beaches or bayonet charges through gunfire, but about maps, about supply lines, about decisions made in quiet rooms where the lives of tens of thousands were weighed with pencils and rulers. To understand why that morning mattered so much, we need to rewind a few months, to a time when the Americans were still learning a harsh lesson in blood. On tiny islands scattered across the ocean, mere ink dots on the map, war had taken its most brutal form. Each island was a closed world where defenders had time to dig in, build bunkers, and wait for attackers to walk straight into their traps. Tarawa was one such place. An island so small you could walk from one end to the other in under an hour, yet deadly enough to turn the surrounding sea into a graveyard. Reefs that once seemed harmless became deadly barricades. American troops, confident that overwhelming firepower would be enough, paid with their lives as they waded through shallow waters under intersecting fire from concrete bunkers that seemed impossible to destroy. When Tarawa was over, the victory brought no relief. Only a chilling question that lingered in the minds of military planners. If each island cost this much to take, how long would the road to Japan be? And how many Americans would never come home? That very question is what made the morning of February 17th, 1944, so different. Because before the Hellcats even left their carriers, something had quietly shifted in the way Americans saw the war. They began to question the assumptions that centuries of warfare had taught them to accept. They began to ask whether a head-on clash with every heavily fortified island was really the only path forward. And as those planes vanished into the night, carrying with them a plan to render Truk meaningless, the island-hopping war took a turn. A turn that didn't start with gunfire on the beaches, but with a cold, strategic calculation, where every island was placed on a scale weighed against the human cost. From that point on, the bloody equation of island warfare became clearer than ever before, opening the door to a new kind of thinking, a way of thinking that would define how America moved forward through the long, brutal path of the Pacific. After that misty morning over the Pacific, when the American planes vanished into the darkness, the war continued running on its old momentum. On paper, on maps, in military doctrines taught for generations, the logic of warfare had never changed. To advance, you must push aside whatever stands in your way. And in the Pacific, the things blocking the path weren't mobile armies. They were islands. Tiny pieces of land turned into fortresses in the middle of the sea. Each island was a closed world, where defenders held an overwhelming advantage in time. They arrived first, dug first, built first, prepared first. They knew exactly which beaches the enemy would be forced to land on. They knew every current, every coral reef, every angle of fire. When war broke out, an island was no longer just land. It became a trench, a bunker, a deadly trap disguised beneath the peaceful beauty of blue seas and white sand. In traditional military thinking, there was no alternative. You couldn't bypass an island without controlling it. You couldn't secure your supply lines if the enemy held key positions. You couldn't leave a fortress behind. It would become a dagger aimed at your back. So every island had to be taken, every stronghold cleared, every defending soldier killed or forced to surrender. That was the cold logic of the textbooks, and the logic that sent tens of thousands to their deaths. Guadalcanal was where Americans first experienced the true cost of island warfare. The battle dragged on for months, not just on the beaches, but in the jungles, in the air, and at sea. Each passing day was a grinding struggle, where disease, hunger, and fear killed just as surely as bullets and bombs. When Guadalcanal finally ended, it didn't bring a sense of triumph, only deep exhaustion, as if both sides had been crushed by the very island they fought for. But it was Tarawa that delivered the harshest wake-up call. A tiny island, just a dot on the map that the Japanese had turned into a block of concrete and steel. Fortified bunkers were positioned so that every single yard of beach fell under overlapping fire. Machine guns were hidden, only revealing themselves once the enemy entered the kill zone. The coral reefs, which American planners had underestimated, turned the landing into a nightmare. When U.S. Marines stormed Tarawa, they brought with them what any military doctrine would deem overwhelming power: heavy naval bombardment, air support, superior numbers. But that advantage vanished within the first few hours. American soldiers died on the reefs, died in waist-deep water, died before ever reaching the beach. Landing craft became moving targets. No cover, no retreat. After 76 hours, Tarawa was in American hands. But the price paid left even the most battle-hardened officers stunned into silence. Over 3,000 casualties for a patch of land too small to hold a full airfield. Not because of any single tactical mistake, but because the entire equation had been set up in a way that made any other outcome impossible. Tarawa wasn't just a battle. It was a calculation. And the result of that calculation was more terrifying than any defeat. If such a small island could consume so many lives, what would larger, better prepared fortresses demand? How many Americans would have to die if every step forward had to be bought with blood? That question began to haunt military planning rooms, not because America lacked manpower, ships or planes, but because a war can't be measured by production capacity alone. Every death notice sent home chipped away at the national spirit. Every new Tarawa served as a brutal reminder that winning the old-fashioned way might break America before it ever reached Japan's shores. Meanwhile, the map of the Pacific stretched across strategy tables grew more daunting by the day. Tarawa was just the opening act. Ahead lay island after island, each with the potential to become another Tarawa, or worse. And looming above them all, like towering shadows over every discussion, were fortresses so massive that just their statistics were enough to send chills down spines. Rabaul was one of them. a giant base where the Japanese had poured not just troops but their entire strategic confidence. Tens of thousands of soldiers, multiple airfields, a vast underground tunnel network that spanned like a city beneath the earth. If Tarawa was a meat grinder, Rabaul was a waiting blade, sharp enough to slice apart any direct assault. And then there was Truk, deeper in the island chain, the beating heart of Japan's logistics system. More than just a fortress, Truk was the convergence point of the fleet, a hub for resupply, repairs, and coordination. In the old mindset, Truk couldn't be bypassed. It had to be captured, neutralized the traditional way, through a full-scale invasion. But as American officers looked from Tarawa up the chain to those names, Rabaul, Truk, the bloody equation of island warfare became clearer than ever. This was no longer a question of whether these places could be taken. It was a question of how and whether there was another path besides walking straight into the meat grinders already set in place. From that grim obsession, from those cold numbers and the still fresh images of Tarawa, a shift began in the way war was understood. And it was this quiet shift that opened the door to a new way of thinking about the great fortresses ahead, Rabaul and Truk. No longer simply as objectives to be captured, but as strategic problems to be solved in an entirely different way. After Tarawa, the map of the Pacific was no longer just a sheet of paper dotted with tiny specks scattered across the vast blue ocean. It became an indictment. Each name circled on that map was a reminder of blood, of time, of the price America would pay if it continued down the same old path. And among those names, two cast a shadow so heavy that every discussion in the war room seemed to suffocate under their weight. Rabaul. Just saying the name changed the air in the room. Rabaul wasn't some isolated islet like Tarawa, nor a temporary front like Guadalcanal. It was a strategic monster. A fortress the Japanese had built with the patience of those who knew they were laying the foundation for years of war. Hundreds of thousands of troops were stationed there. Airfields of all sizes intersected across the terrain, capable of launching continuous sorties day and night. A tunnel system burrowed deep into the mountains, not just for shelter, but to survive under relentless bombardment for as long as it took. Rabaul didn't just control the skies. It controlled the rhythm of war in the South Pacific. From there, Japanese aircraft could reach Allied supply lines. From there, the Japanese Navy could threaten any force pushing westward. By traditional logic, Rabaul was a bottleneck that had to be undone. No one doubted it could be taken, but the haunting question was, at what cost? The officers who had walked through Tarawa knew that question all too well. If a tiny island could swallow thousands of lives in just a few days, what would Rabaul, with its scale and preparedness, do over the course of months? How many landing craft would burn? How many soldiers would die before even touching the sand? How many telegrams would arrive on doorsteps back home, each one delivering a blow to the nation's heart? And before that question could even be answered, the map threw up another name, one that stirred even deeper unease. Truk. If Rabaul was a fortress, then Truk was the heart. A massive lagoon ringed by sharp and treacherous coral reefs, large enough to hold an entire fleet. It wasn't just a garrison, it was a command center, a logistics hub, the spiritual anchor of Japan's entire Pacific strategy. From Truk, warships sailed out in every direction. From Truk, supplies were sent to the frontline outposts. From Truk, the war was sustained. For years, the Japanese believed Truk was untouchable, and that belief wasn't without merit. Nature had granted them an almost perfect natural fortress. All they had to do was reinforce it, with coastal guns, airfields, fuel, and ammunition depots built to last through a drawn-out war. If there was any place the Japanese believed would require a direct, bloody confrontation, it was Truk. To American planners, Truk was like an unsolvable equation. Ignoring it meant leaving a massive threat at their backs. Attacking it the traditional way meant willingly stepping into a scaled-up Tarawa, multiplied many times over. Every option came with risks capable of shifting the entire course of the war. The longer they stared at the map, the more impossible it seemed. Not because America lacked power, but because that power, if misapplied, could turn into a double-edged sword. Every major landing would cost not just lives, but morale. Every fortress assaulted would drag the war out by months, even years. And all the while, mainland Japan still lay ahead, with even deeper, stronger, more determined defenses waiting for the final battle. Rabaul and Truk, in that sense, weren't just military targets. They were symbols of deadlock. They represented a path that America could take, but at a price that might exceed what society could endure. Casualty statistics no longer felt like dry data. They became ghosts in every meeting, whispering reminders that every misstep would be paid for in real blood by real people. It was in this atmosphere that doubt began to creep in. Not doubt about winning the war, but doubt about how to win it. Was the logic of every fortress must be taken truly unbreakable? Did every strongpoint have to be assaulted head-on? Or was there a way to render these giant fortresses meaningless, without ever setting foot on their beaches? At first, these questions surfaced only as passing thoughts, easy to dismiss in a military culture shaped by rigid rules. But Tarawa had proven something undeniable, that the cost of not asking those questions was far greater. And Rabaul and Truk, with their scale and terror, pushed those doubts into a space where they could no longer be ignored. In the war rooms, amid sprawling maps and pencils sketching lines of advance, there were moments of deep, drawn-out silence. Not the hesitation of the weak, but the reflection of those who understood they were standing at a historical crossroads. One path led onward by the old playbook, where sacrifice was expected and bloodshed inevitable. The other was murkier, without precedent, but held the rare promise of something war almost never allows, the chance to win without sacrificing tens of thousands of lives. And then in one of those silences, a question was spoken aloud. A question so simple it felt like a challenge to centuries of military tradition. A question not aimed at fortresses, troop counts, or firepower, but directly at the core assumptions of the entire war. From that moment, the course of strategic thinking began to shift, and with it, a new chapter began, a chapter where one question was enough to change history. The silence in the war room that day wasn't like any silence that had come before. It wasn't a pause waiting for an order, nor the tense stillness before launching an attack. It was the silence of people who had just realized that everything they thought they understood about war might be wrong. Spread out before them was the Pacific map, covered in crisscrossing pencil lines, arrows pointing westward, and red circles marking the heavily fortified Japanese positions. Rabaul, Truk, Wake, Kavieng, each name was a challenge. Each location a potential Tarawa, ready to turn firepower into futility with well-prepared beaches and buried bunkers. For years, no one questioned this logic. Fortresses had to be captured. Islands had to be flagged. The path forward had to be cleared, mile by bloody mile. This wasn't just doctrine. It was belief. A belief rooted in European history, in breached walls and shattered front lines, in the triumphant storming of enemy strongholds. But the Pacific was not Europe. Here, the ocean was vast and empty, and every island was a perfect trap waiting for the attacker. Tarawa had shaken that belief, not through defeat, but through victory that cost too much. A victory that forced commanders to ask, if this is the cost of a tiny island, what would be the cost of storming a true fortress? How many more Tarawas could America endure before victory itself became an unbearable burden? And then, among the tangle of thoughts, a question was spoken. It didn't ring out as a bold declaration. It came like a quiet reflection, so soft it could have been missed. What if we don't attack? At first, it sounded out of place. Don't attack? Did that mean retreat? Giving up? But the man asking wasn't suggesting surrender. He wasn't turning back. He was questioning the path forward. If a fortress wasn't attacked, but also couldn't be resupplied, couldn't project force, couldn't threaten anyone, was it still a fortress or just a useless chunk of concrete marooned at sea? If tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded on an island, without ships, without planes, with no mission left to carry out, what real contribution did they still make to the war? That question was like a crack in an old wall of thinking. At first, just a small fissure, but the more they considered it, the wider it grew. Commanders began to look at the map with new eyes, no longer as a list of targets to seize, but as a network of supply routes, logistical nodes, and exploitable gaps. Instead of asking, how do we defeat this fortress? They began to ask, why does this fortress exist? And as the question changed, so did the answers. Rabaul existed to control the skies and seas around it. Truk existed to feed Japan's entire Pacific war machine. If those functions could be cut off, then whether the fortress still stood or not became irrelevant. A fortress that couldn't shoot, couldn't supply, couldn't support the front was already defeated, even if its flag still waved. It wasn't an easy idea to accept. It ran counter to the instincts of war, where victory is usually measured in land taken and enemies destroyed. This new approach demanded a different kind of discipline. The discipline not to charge into battles the enemy was ready for, the discipline to ignore seemingly important targets, and the discipline to believe that war could be won from a distance, with lines drawn on a map. But the more they analyzed it, the more the logic of that one question became undeniable. Every major amphibious assault didn't just cost lives. It cost time, the most precious resource in a long war. Every fortress attacked meant months of grinding combat and inevitable losses. Meanwhile, if they chose instead to strike less defended targets with high strategic value, they could begin cutting off parts of Japan's war body, turning its great fortresses into isolated prisons. The question, what if we don't attack, gradually stopped sounding like an outlier. It became the center of every discussion. It forced officers to imagine a different kind of war, one where victory didn't come from capturing every island, but from controlling the space around them. A kind of war where the goal wasn't to kill every enemy soldier, but to render them useless in the larger picture. It was a dangerous leap in thinking, one with few precedents. If it failed, the consequences would be severe. A bypassed fortress could lash out, cut supply lines, spark disaster. But if it succeeded, it could change the pace of the entire war, shorten the road to victory, and most importantly, save tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Once the question was accepted, even partially, the map of the Pacific began to redraw itself. The arrows no longer pointed straight at the massive fortresses. They curved, they leapt, they left behind vast concrete strongholds still waiting for battles that would never come. The focus shifted, from beaches to skies, from bunkers to airstrips, from direct engagement to logistical control. And in that moment, when the map was viewed through new eyes, a strategy began to take shape. A strategy not built on mass sacrifice, but on cold calculation. A strategy where progress wasn't measured in islands taken, but in fortresses cut off. From that one simple question, a path emerged toward a completely new kind of war, where America wouldn't win through blood alone, but by turning the very map of the Pacific into its most powerful weapon. When that seemingly simple question was accepted, the war in the Pacific began to shift in a strange and subtle way. There was no sudden order, no loud declaration of a new doctrine, only a quiet adjustment in how the Americans looked at the map. The red circles that once marked the great Japanese fortresses began to lose their central place. Instead, the eyes of strategists drifted toward the empty spaces, areas with lighter defenses but perfectly positioned along supply lines, air corridors, and the fragile connective tissue of Japan's entire war effort. Leapfrogging. It sounded harmless, even childish, but behind the name lay a radical reversal of military thinking. Instead of grinding forward, step by step, smashing everything in their path, the Americans chose to leap over the strongest targets, not because they couldn't fight, but because they understood that fighting was no longer the most effective way to win. In this strategy, islands were no longer judged by how heavily fortified they were, but by how useful they could be. An island with weak defenses but room for an airfield became more valuable than a concrete fortress sitting off the main supply line. A lightly garrisoned spot that could dominate the skies might become the blade that severed the lifeline of a major base behind it. War, in this way, was no longer a direct clash between armies, but a puzzle of space and time. The Americans weren't trying to destroy every Japanese unit. They were trying to make those units irrelevant. A fortress that was bypassed wasn't an immediate threat, not if it was cut off entirely, not if its planes couldn't fly for lack of fuel, not if its ships couldn't sail because the skies now belonged to the enemy. This is what made leapfrogging both smart and cruel. Smart, because it saved the lives of the attackers. Cruel, because it turned tens of thousands of enemy soldiers into prisoners, not of war, but of their own fortresses. They weren't defeated in glorious battle. They were defeated by isolation, by hunger, by the slow crawl of time. The strategy demanded immense confidence. Skipping over a major fortress meant accepting risk. If the calculations were wrong, that fortress might counterattack, cut supply lines, or spark disaster. So leapfrogging wasn't about avoiding combat. It was about choosing to fight where the enemy was weakest, while still keeping enough force to contain where they were strongest. Air power became the pillar of this new mindset. Airfields were now more valuable than beaches. To control the sky was to control the pulse of war. Once American planes could launch from newly captured bases, surrounding Japanese fortresses became easy targets for blockade. There was no need to take the land, just cut off the fuel. No need to charge, just choke the supply. The Navy's role shifted too. Instead of solely supporting beach landings with heavy fire, it became the force that sealed off the sea. Every Japanese convoy sunk was another blade cutting into the survival of isolated bases. Every day without reinforcements was a day a fortress lost its strategic meaning. What's striking is that leapfrogging didn't make the war any easier on the human spirit. In fact, it demanded a new kind of tension. Gone were the clear endings of major battles. Gone was the flag planted atop a conquered fortress. In its place were long weeks of waiting, watching, blockading with the belief that the enemy was slowly starving behind an invisible curtain. Yet it was this very patience that made the difference. With every successful leap, Japan's defensive line unraveled. Each breach created a chain reaction. Fortresses, once built to withstand direct assault, were now helpless against an enemy that never arrived. On a human level, leapfrogging was a painful paradox. It saved tens of thousands of American lives by avoiding slaughter on hostile beaches, but it condemned hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers to a slower, quieter, and perhaps crueler fate. No final battle, no retreat, just isolation, trapped inside fortresses once thought invincible, now turned into prisons floating in the sea. As the war continued, the effectiveness of the strategy became clearer. The American advance accelerated. Instead of being bogged down for months on a single island, they could quickly build new bases, expand air reach, then leap forward again. The Pacific map, once crowded with intimidating red circles, gradually cleared. Not because the fortresses had been taken, but because they had been quietly neutralized. And among all the examples of leapfrogging, one name stood out as the clearest proof of this new way of thinking. A massive fortress once believed too important to skip. A base that, if attacked head-on, could have crippled the entire Pacific campaign. But it didn't fall to bombs or shellfire. It fell to absolute isolation. That fortress was Rabaul. Here, leapfrogging stopped being a theory on a map. It became the raw, undeniable reality of modern war. And the story of Rabaul, the abandoned fortress, is where the strategy of winning with the map, not with blood, revealed both its full power and its full tragedy. Rabaul did not fall in a day, nor did it fall in a single battle. It died slowly, quietly, in the eerie silence of a fortress the world had chosen to leave behind. When the Americans decided not to launch a direct assault, Rabaul remained intact on the map. It still had troops, still had guns, still had airfields and tunnels. But the one thing it no longer had was a future. At first, many Japanese officers refused to believe the enemy would actually bypass Rabaul. In their minds, a fortress of that scale had to be a target. They waited for heavier bombing raids, for landing craft to appear on the horizon, for the decisive battle they had spent years preparing for. But day after day, it never came. Instead, something far more subtle and far more terrifying began to unfold. American aircraft started appearing in places that had once seemed insignificant. Small islands, lightly defended, suddenly became bustling air bases. From these newly built runways, American squadrons took off, not to capture Rabaul, but to contain it. The sky slowly slipped out of Japan's control. Every reconnaissance flight, every surgical bombing raid was a reminder that Rabaul was being seen, monitored, encircled. The U.S. Navy never entered Rabaul's harbor. They stayed at a distance, along the more critical shipping lanes, striking down convoy after convoy. No large-scale assault was needed, just steady pressure. Every sunken supply ship was another breath cut from the fortress. Fuel ran low, ammunition stopped arriving, food grew scarce. Stores once meant to sustain a short siege now had to stretch for a siege with no end in sight. Inside Rabaul, the lives of tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers began to change. At first, discipline remained firm. Units continued their drills, stayed combat ready, convinced that the great battle was only a matter of time. But the battle never came. Instead came long, empty days, long, sleepless nights, listening to enemy planes fly overhead, knowing there was nothing they could do to stop them. Time became the greatest enemy. Not the high-stakes minutes of a firefight, but the dragging months of slow decay. Disease spread, malnutrition became critical. Soldiers trained for decisive combat were now growing sweet potatoes and cassava, forced to find ways to keep themselves alive in a fortress built to fight, not to survive isolation. Strategically, Rabaul had been defeated without ever being taken. It no longer controlled the skies. It could no longer support other bases. It became a massive frozen force, unable to advance, unable to retreat, contributing nothing to the broader war effort. Each passing day, Rabaul became less of a spear aimed at the Allies and more of a black hole draining Japan's own strength. For the Americans, bypassing Rabaul was a bold gamble that paid off. They saved tens of thousands of lives that a direct assault would have cost. They kept up their momentum, leapfrogging westward, drawing closer to their ultimate objective without getting stuck in a war of attrition. Rabaul, once a nightmare scenario, became living proof of the power of this new kind of thinking. But that success raised a larger question. If a massive fortress like Rabaul could be neutralized without being conquered, what about the rest of Japan's strategic centers? Could leapfrogging work at even greater scales against even deeper, stronger, more central enemy positions? And no name made that question feel heavier than Truk. If Rabaul was the abandoned fortress, then Truk was the beating heart of Japan's entire Pacific war machine. It wasn't just a defensive base, it was a staging ground for the fleet, a fuel depot, a repair center, a launch point for major campaigns. For a long time, Truk had been seen as untouchable, the stronghold that, if it remained standing, could still shift the balance of the war. Bypassing Truk wouldn't be like bypassing Rabaul. The risks were far higher. A fully operational Truk could launch counterattacks, threaten American supply lines, or unravel the entire leapfrogging strategy if underestimated. So Truk couldn't simply be ignored. It had to be neutralized, but in a way that avoided the blood-soaked trap of a direct amphibious assault. After Rabaul, the Americans had the confidence to think bigger. They knew that war didn't have to end with flags planted on every fortress, but they also knew that some centers of power couldn't just be silently isolated. Truk required a strike powerful enough to strip it of its strategic role, but wise enough not to become another Tarawa or another Rabaul. And from that realization, a new operation was planned. Not a landing, not a ground campaign, but an assault from the air and sea, swift, precise, aimed straight at the core functions of the fortress. A campaign that would turn Truk from the heart of the Pacific War into a graveyard of sunken ships in just a matter of days. The name of that operation was Operation Hailstone. Truk had grown far too accustomed to feeling safe. For years, that vast lagoon had felt like an impenetrable cauldron, a haven where Japan's warships anchored with near absolute confidence. The thick coral reefs surrounding it weren't just natural barriers, they were psychological walls. They made Truk a place where, even as war swept across the Pacific, people believed it would be among the last bases to face a challenge. Truk wasn't built to be sneaked up on. It was built for a final showdown, a direct confrontation where its defenses would crush any attacker bold enough to try. And that's why, when the first signs of danger emerged, they weren't taken seriously. Scattered reconnaissance reports, hints of American fleet movements in areas that seemed unrelated. To many Japanese officers, it looked like nothing more than routine shifts in a long war. Truk still had ships, still had planes, still had fuel. It was still the center, still the heart. But that heart was now being surrounded in a way no old doctrine had ever described. Operation Hailstone wasn't the start of an invasion. It was a coldly calculated, preemptive strike. When the U.S. fleet approached the waters off Truk, they brought no landing divisions, no plans to storm the beaches, no intention of setting foot on the island. Instead, they brought aircraft carriers, fighter squadrons, and bombers, ready to turn the skies above the lagoon into a killing field. At dawn, American planes plunged into the airspace the Japanese had once believed untouchable. The island's airstrips became the first targets. Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground, still lined up on the runways, never given the chance to rise. Warships anchored in the lagoon, once symbols of power, became sitting targets. Bombs and torpedoes rained down, not in a single chaotic burst, but in a steady, precise, relentless rhythm. For 2 days, Truk endured what it had never been built to withstand: destruction without invasion. Warships burst into flames, capsized, sank to the lagoon floor, still chained to their moorings. Transports, supply vessels, repair ships, the lifeblood of the base, were sunk, one by one. Fuel depots erupted into towering black clouds, scarred reminders that the fortress was bleeding out. The Japanese fought back, but it was a losing battle. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the sky, but air superiority was already lost. Once American planes ruled the skies, defense became disjointed. There was no defensive line to hold, no beachhead to defend, just stranded ships and disabled airfields. And the most terrifying thing wasn't the level of destruction. It was what that destruction meant. When Operation Hailstone ended, Truk was still standing. The island hadn't been taken. The Japanese flag still flew. But Truk's role in the war was over. It was no longer a fleet base, no longer a logistics hub, no longer a nerve center for Japan's Pacific campaign. Truk had become a graveyard of ships, a vast, crippled complex stripped of its vital function. The Americans had achieved something traditional warfare rarely allows: a decisive strategic victory without landing troops, without occupying ground, without turning beaches into bloodbaths. Truk hadn't been defeated in the usual sense. It had been rendered useless. On the map, the implications were enormous. A major strategic center had been eliminated in just a few days. The American advance no longer had to worry about attacks from behind. Leapfrogging was no longer just a theory. It had proven that even the strongest fortress could be neutralized by targeting function, not form. But inside Truk, the story was very different. When the bombs stopped falling and the American planes vanished from the sky, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were left to face a cold truth. The war they had trained for had passed them by. There would be no last stand, no chance to counterattack, no road back home. They remained in a fortress that no longer had purpose, still crowded with men, but cut off from the war. The ships beneath the lagoon were now massive corpses, a daily reminder that escape was no longer possible. Supplies grew scarce, fuel was gone, ammunition had to be rationed. Truk, once the heart of the war, had become an isolated island left behind by the tides of history. Operation Hailstone didn't just destroy a base, it created a new kind of warfare. A state where tens of thousands of soldiers weren't defeated in battle, but were left behind by it. They still wore their uniforms, still held to discipline, still waited for orders, but the orders never came. And from that moment, a new tragedy began. Not a tragedy of explosions, but a tragedy of silence. As the war moved westward, as new battles erupted farther away, Truk and fortresses like it began to fade into memory. Thousands of men remained trapped in a war that had left them behind. The story of Truk, then, doesn't end with Operation Hailstone. It simply moves into a new chapter, a quieter, more painful one. A chapter about soldiers abandoned living inside fortresses that were never invaded and never given the chance to fight. When the bombing finally ceased and the skies above Truk returned to their familiar silence, what lingered wasn't a sense of victory or defeat, but a void too difficult to name. For the tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers still stationed on the island, the war hadn't ended with a surrender or a climactic final battle. It had simply moved on. It passed them by, leaving them in place, surrounded by fortresses built for a moment that would never come. At first, they believed it was only temporary, that after Operation Hailstone the invasion would follow, that the enemy would return and they would finally fight, just as they had been trained. Officers continued to hold meetings, to issue orders, to reassure their men to remain patient. Discipline was upheld, because in the Japanese military mindset, waiting was still a form of combat. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and nothing happened. No supply ships docked. No fleets returned, no new orders arrived from Tokyo. The sunken vessels remained where they fell, resting beneath the lagoon, giant rusting corpses, silent gravestones of a vanished force. And with each passing week, hope that Truk might once again become a center of the war dimmed. Life on the island had to adapt. Men trained to fire warship cannons, to fly aircraft, to fight in large-scale naval engagements, now learned new skills. They planted sweet potatoes. They built gardens beside concrete bunkers. They raised chickens and pigs, making use of every available patch of land just to survive. The fortress, once built to withstand bombs and bullets, had become a shelter for an isolated community. Time became the cruelest enemy of all. Unlike bombs, it didn't kill instantly. It eroded. Food shortages led to malnutrition. Disease spread in poor medical conditions. Small injuries became deadly without medicine. Each soldier had to learn how to endure scarcity and the crushing fatigue of endless waiting. But the worst suffering wasn't physical. It was mental. War, however brutal, still offers soldiers a purpose: to fight for something. On Truk, that purpose slowly faded. There was no enemy in sight, no clear mission, just endless days that blurred together. Waiting itself became a punishment. Many eventually came to realize a bitter truth. Their fortress had never been taken, but their war had ended long ago. They hadn't been defeated in a battle. They were defeated because they had been left out of the war. As history surged toward Japan's home islands and beyond, they remained behind, fragments of a strategy that no longer mattered. In Rabaul, in Truk, and in other fortresses scattered across the Pacific, the same script played out. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded in bases that had lost all strategic value. They still wore their uniforms, still saluted the flag every morning, still followed routines, but those routines grew hollow, no longer tied to any real objective. Some of these men stayed on their islands for years, never firing another shot. Some died from illness, accidents, or starvation while the war raged far away. Their deaths weren't part of any battle reports, not recorded in the stories of valor or defeat. They were quiet, almost invisible, like their existence in the final chapters of the war. Ironically, many of these untouched fortresses remained intact all the way until the war's end. When Japan finally surrendered, the soldiers at Truk and Rabaul learned, officially, that the war was over. For them, that moment didn't feel like sudden defeat. It felt like a strange kind of release, a hollow relief. Years of waiting, years of silent sacrifice had ended without ever leading to the battle they were prepared to fight. The story of these forgotten soldiers is the unseen cost of the leapfrogging strategy. That strategy saved countless American lives. It shortened the path to victory. It proved the power of modern military thinking. But it also created islands of abandonment, places where men continued to live and die in a war that no longer needed them. Looking back, fortresses like Truk and Rabaul were never destroyed in the traditional sense. They weren't crushed by invasion. And that's what made their tragedy even more profound. These men had been trained to die in battle, but instead they were forced to live through irrelevance. They weren't remembered as heroes of a great defense, nor as clear losers of a final fight. They existed in the gray space of history, caught between glory and defeat, between memory and oblivion. And perhaps that is the quiet price of a war won through strategy. When maps are redrawn, when the strongest fortresses become dead zones, the people inside them are pushed to the margins as well. They are proof that in modern warfare, the greatest tragedy doesn't always come with the roar of bombs, but in the long, silent years that follow when the war has moved on, and the soldiers are left behind, trapped between a past that has ended and a future that no longer belongs to them. When the Pacific War came to an end, the maps that had once blanketed the desks of strategists were rolled up and filed away. The arrows, the red circles, the lines of advance that had once dictated the fate of millions became memories. But one thing did not vanish with the sound of gunfire: the lesson that war can be won without fighting it in the way we've always been taught. America didn't win just because it had more ships, more planes, or superior industrial output. Those things mattered, but they don't explain how a chain of fortresses once deemed impregnable became irrelevant in just a few years. The true difference lay in a moment when someone dared to question the very rules that war had followed for centuries. Rabaul and Truk were never taken in the traditional sense. There were no flags raised on bloody beaches, no thunderous amphibious assaults, and yet they ceased to be threats. They became shadows of what they had been. Full of troops and fortifications, but strategically hollow. That is the great paradox of modern war. A place can remain intact in form and yet die in function. Leapfrogging was more than just a military tactic. It was a transformation in how power and purpose were understood. Instead of confronting the enemy's strength where it was most prepared, the Americans chose to deny that strength a role in the game. They struck at connections, at logistics, at time itself. They understood that in a long war, the victor isn't always the one who hits hardest, but the one who makes the other side swing at empty air. That kind of victory from a distance can look cold. It lacks the epic imagery of heroic sacrifice. It doesn't always produce the kind of legends that echo through generations. But that's precisely why it sheds less blood. Tens of thousands of American soldiers didn't have to die on beaches turned into meat grinders. That was the price strategy paid in place of human lives. But victory through strategy is not a victory without tragedy. The Japanese soldiers left behind on those isolated fortresses are a painful reminder that every clever strategy has a human cost. They weren't defeated in a dramatic clash. They were defeated in the slow erosion of waiting, in the feeling of being forgotten by history itself. The war moved on without them, leaving them to live inside a void without a name. That's why the story of Truk and Rabaul isn't just a military narrative, it's a human one. It reminds us that war doesn't only happen on maps or in conference rooms, it happens in the quiet lives of those caught within decisions made far above them. And if we look further, the lesson extends far beyond World War II. In today's world, where conflict no longer always takes the shape of direct confrontation, the idea of striking function instead of form still resonates. Power today lies not only in armies, but in supply chains, in data, in information, in connectivity. A country, an organization, even a person can be rendered irrelevant not by being attacked, but by being isolated from what gives them meaning. The fortress that was never attacked is, in that sense, not just a piece of history. It is a metaphor, a warning that strength, if misplaced, can become a burden. That what is built to resist direct assault can still fall to a completely different kind of pressure. And that sometimes victory doesn't come from defeating the enemy in battle, but from making them unable to play at all. As we close this story, what lingers is not the image of sunken ships in Truk's lagoon, nor the empty tunnels of Rabaul, but the moment someone dared to think differently, dared to question what once seemed obvious, dared to redraw the map instead of shedding more blood on it. History is often told through battles, dates, and numbers. But sometimes the greatest turning points begin with a quiet question spoken in a silent room. And that question can save countless lives and reshape how the world understands war. If you have thoughts about the leapfrogging strategy, the fortresses left behind, or the lessons the Pacific War leaves for today's world, we invite you to share your reflections in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to History War, as we continue to uncover the stories where strategy, decision, and human fate intersect in ways no one ever expected.